Well, thank you for joining me this afternoon, Sinclair, to discuss your newest book, Devoted to God's Church, Core Values for Christian Fellowship.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been very exciting to receive this book from the printer, and it's been a joy to read through it as I prepared for this discussion. I wanted to start our discussion by asking you what led to the writing of this book. Was there a particular issue that you wanted to address, or is it something more general than that?
Well, it wasn't really a particular issue, Pat. I think it was that I was trying to think of a book that I would want to give to somebody who was a potential church member. That was my basic idea. Or somebody who was already a church member and really needed some recalibration about what it meant to belong to the church. And I think what I had noticed probably over the last 25 years or so, there have been many, many books written by Christian leaders in churches about how to do church. But it struck me there weren't so many books of substance about actually how to be a member of the church. So that most of the books, it struck me, were being written by leaders for leaders. And some of them kind of smacked a little of this made our church successful, and if you follow that pattern, it will make your church successful too. And I was personally much more interested in what the church was than in strategies to make the church successful. So, that was uppermost in my mind. And also something that I think has been true of a number of the books that I've written, part of my thinking has been, can I write something that a busy pastor might be able to use? If somebody was discussing, for example, in this instance, church membership, that he couldn't say, well, I can spend 15 hours with you anytime you want. But in the absence of that, to say, well, here's a book that roughly is what I would want to say to you. And if you read through it, then maybe we can meet up and we can talk together about it. So in my mind, there were really several levels of function for the book. So new members, recalibration of our own membership, and usefulness to Christian ministers and other leaders in churches to help them help people come into membership and understand what church membership really involves.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It actually dovetails nicely into my next question, which when you touch on the subject of who you write for and the kinds of books that you see on the market, recently here at the Banner of Truth, we've been privileged to publish a number of books by you, including From the Mouth of God, Maturity, Growing Up and Going On in the Christian Life, Let's Study James in the Let's Study series, A Child in the Manger, and also Devoted to God, Blueprints for Sanctification. With these 5 books, and including your newest book here today, they seem to be directed towards Christians in the pew, or at least they're made to be an accessible read. And you mentioned some of your rationale there. It seems like it's a passion of yours to write that kind of book. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's where I've always seen myself belong. Obviously, just in terms of how God's providence has operated in my life, I've spent a lot of time in the academy, but the academy has never been my passion. The church has always been at the center of my personal devotion in service, and the ministry of the word in the church has been very central to me as a recipient of that ministry, and also as a minister of the gospel. And so, having had the benefit of spending time in the academy, I think what I've most wanted to do was to try and take the benefit, the privileges that I've had there, and melt them down, as it were, and make them accessible to Christians in general. And I think also in that sense, to try to do what I can, given the fact that I've had so far had time and energy to do it, to give something to ministers, pastors, church leaders that they might not themselves have time to produce by themselves, but would have enough sympathy with what I was trying to say that it could be serviceable to them. So actually, I think through most of my life, the idea of how can I serve my fellow servants of Christ as well as the whole body of Christ has actually been quite a big driving force to me. Because I think very early on when I'm not even sure I was out of theological college when this dawned on me, just by observing ministers that I had heard or that I was coming to know. One almost gets the sense there is as broad a diversity of gift among ministers as there is in the body of Christ in general. And that kind of set me thinking when I was in my early 20s, what gift has God given me that I can use for my fellow ministers? And say, I think Christ has given this to me. It might be ability, it might be time, it might be the opportunity to write, as in my own case, that I can give to you and say, I think the Lord Christ has given me this for you, and how can I serve you in that way? So I think that is probably true of quite a lot of the books I've written, that they've had that kind of background. It might not have been evident in the books themselves, but that's been the background part.
Yeah, well, I think that's why people have come to appreciate your writing, is that balance that you try to strike, and the Lord's helped you to do so. So we mentioned a couple of the books that you've published recently. I mentioned Devoted to God, Blueprints for Sanctification. This book's called Devoted to God's Church. So similar title. I think some of our readers and listeners might wonder, is this in some way a sequel to Devoted to God, the one that you did a couple of years back?
Well, they certainly could think about it that way, but it's a kind of prequel, if I can use the modern jargon, because I think I had put most of it together before I started writing Devoted to God. And that partly explains why there are not chapters in Devoted to God about how does this, it's on sanctification, how does this work out in the community of the church. I hope that's not absent from it, but the other book was actually kind of already there and I hadn't got round to completing it. So in a sense, they really do belong together. I don't think you could actually put them into one volume because there's a slightly different feel, I think, about the two books. But they're very much integrated in my own thinking.
Okay, that's helpful. So we won't use the language of Devoted to God Strikes Back. We'll take that out of our jargon. That's helpful.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea.
Well, I thought we could talk a little bit about the theme of the book, Devoted to God's Church, and begin with just the opening question. What exactly does it mean to be devoted to God's church? Yeah,
it's a wee while since I've written the book, and to be honest, I could not give you a list of the chapters, but very foundational in my own thinking. There's really two passages in the New Testament. One is Matthew 16:18, Christ saying, I will build my church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And then the conversation with Peter, and then his speaking about the cross. That statement very much seems to me to present to us what is at the heart of Jesus' vision for his own ministry, to build the church. And coupled with that, in the Paul's statement in Ephesians that Christ loved the church and gave himself for the church. And these two ideas that central to Christ's ministry is his church building program. And central to that is that he loved and loves the church and gave himself for the church. These two passages to me carry with them the implication that if we are followers of Christ, then we need to learn to share Christ's vision, and we need to learn to share Christ's love. And this means, I think, for us that the church, obviously, I'm thinking especially of the church local. The church really ought to lie at the very center of our lives. And we must constantly be asking, how do we negotiate our lives out of that center in Christ and in Christ's people? And in a way, there's a very real connection between a theme that really runs through Devoted to God and my concern in Devoted to God's church, and that is union with Christ is quite a big theme in Devoted to God. But the implication of being united to Christ that comes out in many of the ways in which the New Testament expresses it is that if you're united to Christ, you are thereby united to everybody who is united to Christ. So that if you think of the vine and the branches, or the sheep and the shepherd, the husband and the wife, so many of those ways in which our union with Christ is expressed imply that it's not an individualistic thing, but is a real community thing.
Yeah, thank you.
I think maybe I could add, Pat, that another consideration there, which I think I maybe expressed more in the dedication than I did in the book, is that the church, the people of God, the family of God, has meant more to me than I could possibly express. And it, has been very much at the center of my own existence, and has been the fellowship into which we have tried to enfold our own family. So personally and existentially, I think I could say in Christ the church means everything to me.
Picking up on how the church has been a blessing to you personally, I wonder, what is the most as a pastor, what is the most encouraging thing that you've heard church members say about the church? And then conversely, what is the most discouraging thing that you hear?
I think absolutely the most encouraging thing I think I hear or have heard is at the end of the Lord's Day for people to say, "This has been a glorious day." Because I think in that statement, which I've heard often enough, you catch the sense, one, of the centrality of worship, two, the importance of the ministry of the word, three, the sheer glory of being in the presence of the risen Christ, and the privilege of access to God by the Spirit in worship. So that in my own view, it's in those occasions when we worship together that the church most fully and clearly is the church. And I think another tremendously encouraging thing that I think I've heard is when people begin to voice that this is their family. Because somewhere along the line I came to the conclusion that the most important, if I can use the word model, although I don't think it actually is a model, the most important description of the church in the Bible is that it's the family of God. And that, I think, has very much driven part of my own sense of what I am about through being a pastor, through the ministry of the gospel. And I think it's become increasingly important to me the more I've observed the radical dysfunctionality of family life in the late 20th, early 21st century that makes this dimension of the New Testament's view of the church a very powerful witness in the world. And so just to extend the encouragement part, I think it has been a tremendous encouragement in churches I've served when you sense that people who are outsiders realize that this is what is true of this community. And this is one of the reasons it is so radically different from other communities. And one of the reasons why they sense what they sense when they're among this people. The most discouraging thing, to be honest, I don't know what the most discouraging thing is. I think it's probably not, in my experience, been what people have said, although what people have said has often been a discouragement to me. I think the most discouraging thing is watching how people respond and sensing sometimes that people simply do not see what is there because they are actually looking for the wrong thing. But one thing that does discourage me actually is when people go to other churches and see things they like and then come back and say, we should do this here. Because I think as soon as they say that, you realize you're not really thinking about these people. And you're not thinking from first principles upwards about, this church is these people in this place with these facilities, with these pastors, with these gifts. And our responsibility is not to clone ourselves, not to use as a model something that is alien to us. And I think one of the reasons that discourages me, it doesn't discourage me too long, and thankfully it hasn't discouraged me too often, but one of the reasons it discourages me is because I think it often breathes a sense of dissatisfaction and detachment. I remember many years ago now, and I may even mention this in the book, I was standing at the front of a church with an elder in the church. I was a visitor, and they were receiving new members, many of them. And he turned to me and he said to me, "Don't you think this is the greatest church in the world?" And I remember thinking two things. The first was, no, I don't. I think the church I belong to is the greatest church in the world. And the other thing was, I'm really glad you think that. Because that's what one, certainly as a minister or pastor or elder, or leader of any kind, that's what you long for. That people realize we may not have all the facilities that others have. We may not have the great preacher that another congregation has. But we are us, and Christ loved us and gave himself for us. And he set us down here so that we will learn to love this church, to grow in love for one another, and to grow in love for him. So that's kind of a roundabout answer to the question.
Well, you do share that story in the book with the friend who talks about the church, so that your memory is working. And it was a helpful section. In fact, you touch on a couple of the points that I want to get to next. You make the point early on in the book that this is not a book to teach you how to fix your church, but this is a book to teach you how to fit in and love the church that God's placed you in. Do you think that the propensity to want to fix your own church or fix someone's church
is a particular issue for young Reformed folk, or do you think it's a broader issue that you see in all age groups and all walks of life?
Yeah, I think it is something that has increased for a variety of reasons. I remember when I was a young Christian, people might say, I wish it was this or I wish I was that. But there was neither the literature nor the media pressure. There wasn't the communication that kind of very quickly infiltrated the way people think. So I remember somebody coming into my study in one of the churches I served, and I've kind of amassed quite a number of books over the years, and they walked into the study, and 3 walls were covered in books, and immediately they walked over to Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Church. Picked it out and said, "This is a fantastic book." And, without wanting to comment on Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Church, my heart just sank. But of all these books about the Trinity, about Christ, about sanctification, about the Lord's Supper, and books by authors whose works had lasted for centuries, it was just the way their eyes were drawn to this book, and it really kind of underlined for me. 70 years ago, if somebody had seen that title, it wouldn't have been the first title their eyes were drawn to, and they would have said, "Well, that's an unusual title for a book." So I do think something has happened. And one of the things I think that has happened is this. If the Lord really works in a church and enlarges it spiritually, numerically, at least this would be my own disposition. If people began to say, "How do you do that?" You need to come and tell us. My disposition would be to say, "I'm not coming to tell you. If you want to know, come and see. And watch what you see. And then, if you want, we'll meet together and we can talk about it. But my question will be, what did you see here that teaches you about the dynamics of the biblical teaching that you can go to your own congregation and work that out with your people in your place and in your time?" And so I think over the years I got a wee bit suspicious of even God-given success in a church that then turned itself into literature, telling other people how to do it, or seminars or organizations of consultants and experts. It just seemed to me to be counter to how you see the teaching of the New Testament coming over to the very varied congregations there were in the New Testament.
Helpful. You mentioned a little bit ago about the dynamic of church life and home life and the differences between the two. I think it's something, balancing life's responsibilities is a struggle for many. If we're all honest, probably a struggle for everybody. And a common struggle for families is how to balance life between work, home life, church life. And you've probably heard it said before that, well, I'm not sure we can make it to that service, or I'm not sure we can make it to that midweek meeting because we need some more home time, we need some more family time. So they're making a distinction between the church family and our biological or nuclear families. But you make the startling point in your book that church family isn't like family, it is family. And I wonder if you could unpack that distinction unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah, I think my first principle is this. There's only one marriage that is going to last forever, and that's the marriage between Christ and the church. You know, your marriage, my marriage, however good and blessed by God they may be, appear to be interim arrangements. One of my friends says, well, I hope I'll be near enough in heaven to be able to speak to her, you know, even if there is no marriage in heaven. But I mean, the general point I'm making is that there are things that are really important to us, God-given things that are really important to us, that in the last analysis are functional in this world. But there is a family that will last forever. There is an eternal family that will last forever. And therefore, in a sense, we have got to learn to think of that as the family that has absolute priority for us. And I think actually this is underlined by Jesus' language about family. I mean, clearly Jesus loved his own family and teaches us to love our family, to honor our parents, to love our siblings. And yet he very clearly underlined that his family, in the sense, even in his own life, his family, the church, family of God, had a priority over the natural family. Now, when we see that, I think there are two things I think I would say. One is that insofar as the local church is an expression of that family, a family branch in Carlisle or in Dundee or in wherever it is, insofar as we are a branch of that family, we need to be very wise about how we structure that family life, so that we don't find ourselves or our families in a situation where we actually create tension between the two. And I think in the last 150 years, often that has been created by the overloading of the church with all kinds of things, for all kinds of people, with all kinds of needs, and with all kinds of preferences. So that sometimes in churches, the things that are, people find time for the things that are ancillary to the life of the church. And as a result, they can't find time for the things that are absolutely central. So I think there is a responsibility that the church bears in terms of how it structures its family life. And actually, in my own view, a really important thing in that context is that we put the central things in the central place, and we seek to be as simple as we possibly can be. Now, on the other side, I think sometimes I've encountered Christian families, genuine Christian families, who give absolute priority to their own family and to their own family traditions over the family of God and the traditions of the family of God. And so I think there is a call to us who are nuclear families to make it a priority that we will fold our family life into what I would think of as the absolute elemental or basic structure of the congregation to which we belong. And one of the things I think I've observed in Christian families is there are some Christian families where the parents place great emphasis on their responsibility for the spiritual nurturing of their children. And that's an appropriate thing. But when that begins to be severed from the life of the church, it becomes an inappropriate thing. And I mean, the way I've put it is this: because God has never given to any two parents all the resources they need to raise one child for Jesus Christ. And at least I think I would say in our own experience in as parents raising our children, if you were to say to me what have been the really key elements in that, I would just absolutely have to say that a very key element has been the people in the churches to which we belong. And I think of one particular instance which means so much to me. I may have used it in the book before about an elderly, very ordinary lady in the church that I was minister of, that after the end of the evening service, I was just kind of moving among people, and she was sitting in the back seat, and I stopped, and one of my boys had been home the previous weekend, and I said, I saw you were, not to embarrass the particular boy, I said, I saw you were speaking to, mentioned his name, and this son is a surgeon, and this lady, she probably had no schooling beyond maybe 13 or 14, lived a very ordinary life, very minimal means. She said, it was so good of you, mentioned his name, him being what he is, to come and speak to me last Sunday. And I've never forgotten the thrill I felt inside of saying to her, Mrs., he was doing no more than making a tiny repayment on the debt he owes to you for a number of times when he was running around this place as a 9-year-old on Sunday night, that you showed an interest in him. And you see, my children didn't know much about their grandparents, but here was a woman who had kind of been a granny. And when you think about the families in our church and what we would deprive them of if we didn't let them loose on the vast and rich experience that is represented in any living congregation. I mean, I sometimes say to young people, you should just go and sit down beside somebody in the church, and at the end of the service say, so what's your story? How did you get here? And you'll be absolutely astonished at the stories that lie behind faces that are this old and even older. And it's so thrilling to discover that you belong to this kind of family. One of our granddaughters in the city she lives in, there is actually a statue to an ancestor of her father, who was some kind of admiral or something. I don't know much about him. And I've never forgotten her saying, that she had visited, she said, I visited the statue of my ancestor. And she was so proud of him. He was such a great man. And I thought to myself, well, the church is full of living stones. Yeah, there are the ancestors in heaven as well. But the privileges that we have in the family of God are so vast and rich. And we need to treasure them. And getting back to the question of families, I think we need to so fold our children and ourselves into that community that we benefit from all the gifts that Christ has given to us. That sounds more like a sermon than an answer. I'm sorry.
That's okay. You can preach all you want.
You can edit it.
Yeah, no, it is a lovely story that you share with your son, and I just think what a lovely, godly disposition of that lady to minimize in her own thoughts the efforts that she's put into that relationship, and to focus on the privilege and blessing that she's received. I thought that sounds like a mature Christian response.
Yeah, it was wonderful, really.
Yeah.
And then, when you hear that kind of thing, you cannot but love that woman even more. Mm-hmm. They're so self-effacing, totally self-forgetful. So seeing, I mean, it's like a cup of cold water given to her and seeing it as a priceless gift. And it was a priceless gift for her. What she didn't know was that she had given our family a priceless gift as well.
Yeah, I think we talk about family life and church life, and as a young father of four, my wife and I, we talk a lot about all the opportunities that our kids have. We want to take academics seriously. We love playing sports. There's soccer. There's baseball. We take the kids golfing, and there's just this pressure of the children. We're trying to get them to play piano. There's this pressure to put them in everything, partly because you see other families putting their children into everything, and you think, well, look, I want to stretch my children. I want to push them and give them these great experiences and opportunities so that they can grow, and so that they're not sitting on their hands at home. But then it seems almost impossible to do that as much as you possibly can and have a healthy church life balance. So often we don't do all that we could do, and sometimes you think, oh, I'm not sure if I'm pushing them enough. But then you have those Sunday afternoons, or you have people over from your church, or you're at the evening service or morning service, and you see your children interacting with the other children in the church or with other parents, and you see them looking up to other. I mean, I can speak to my boys, like looking up to other dads and thinking, oh, Mr. So-and-so, I really like what he's doing there. And I thought, well, this is, although in a secular sense, I'm not pressing them as much as I can in the worldly opportunities that aren't necessarily good or bad. What they are getting a very healthy dose of is experience or exposure to Christian witness, to godly homes, to godly fathers who are setting an example for them. And I think, oh, I don't think I'll look back on this in 20 years and think that was a mistake.
No.
Well, if I could move on in a couple of chapters of the book, there's something interesting that you've included in this book that I think some of the listeners might want to know why you've done this. So there's an appendix in here from membership rules for the Rotary Club. And I thought it was interesting that you put that in there, and there's a point you're trying to get across, because you speak, or I should say you do get across, where you speak of how when we start to talk to new or prospective members at our churches about joining and some of the responsibilities that we would hope they would take on and that they would own and that they would pray over, in some people's perspective, that can seem legalistic or even negative. And then you've also given us this Rotary Club membership rule to give us an example of kind of what's out there. So I wonder if you could speak to why you included that in the book.
Yeah, I really included it in the book because I've just noticed so often that if a church says this is how we live as a church, this is what we seek ourselves to do, people may come from a different kind of church, or they may really want to structure church life in a way that's convenient to them, so that if you are to say, so here are the things that are absolutely basic, and if you become a member here, you should commit to these, and people begin to get a bit antsy about this and say, well, that's a wee bit legalistic. I just think one day when I was thinking about that, I just had this sense that the Rotary Club, Rotary International, had certain principles for membership, and I thought, I'll look them up. I just did a Google search, and I think I came up with one particular Rotary Club, and it really blew me out of the water. There were like pages of what was expected of you, and that you would be at every meeting was one of those expectations. And if you missed a meeting, that you would make up the meeting. And I thought, I have never, ever heard a member of the Rotary Club, not that I've known a tremendous number, but I have known some, I've never heard one single one of them say, the Rotary Club is so dreadfully legalistic. It is, you know, we want to belong to the Rotary Club. And when we want to belong to the Rotary Club, we take on board the style of membership that is characteristic of members of Rotary International. And I just thought when I put it into the book, maybe someday some member of Rotary International who is sat very loosely to church membership the penny will drop with them. You know, that they have been willing to take on certain levels of responsibility in a secular organization that they have not been willing to take on with respect to the family of God. And if they see that, they'll recognize there's something completely out of synchronization in the way I'm living the Christian life.
Yeah, I hope that happens.
I think originally it was a footnote, but it was such a long footnote, I think I decided it better go in as an appendix.
Yeah, no, it was shocking.
Another thing, actually, when we lived in Colombia, there was a St. Andrew Society in Colombia, being in the Carolinas, lots of Scots had settled there. And I discovered, to my astonishment, that at one point when we lived there was a 7-year waiting list to become a member, a 7-year waiting list. And I remember one of the deacons in the church greeted me one day with this tremendous smile on his face, who had some Scottish blood somewhere in his ancestry. He said, I've become a member, you know, waiting 7 years. I thought, there's something really interesting about this. So, you know, occasionally I might say to a new members class, you know, if you want to become a member of the St. Andrew Society, there's a waiting list of 7 years. Would you wait that long to become a member of this church? Well, does it mean that much to you? And again, it's, I think, when you see what we are prepared to do for secular things, it really exposes what we may be unprepared to do for the sake of our own spiritual well-being in our families.
Yeah. Well, you've experienced church life. You mentioned your time in Colombia. You're from Scotland. You spent some time in Philadelphia. You've experienced church life from a number of vantage points in the U.S. and in the UK, as a church member and as a church pastor, in smaller churches and larger churches. And I wonder, how have these changes influenced your view of the church?
Well, I think as a minister, I think one of the things I've learned is that it doesn't matter what culture you are in, sin is sin and failure is failure, but the sin will speak with a different accent in different cultures. And you will certainly as a minister, you find different challenges in different cultures. I think I was in at least one culture where being an outsider was in many ways a tremendous disadvantage. And then I think there are other cultures where being an outsider can actually be an advantage. In some ways you get away with things because people think, well, they must do that where he comes from. I think another thing that I've learned, certainly as a minister, is I remember reading a book when I was still a teenager, and it was written by a missionary, and he said, you know, when a missionary goes somewhere overseas, he should keep his mouth shut for a year and listen. And I think one of the things I've discovered in that respect is that individual congregations have got different cultures. And your task as a leader or minister or pastor in the church is not to impose an alien culture on the congregation, but to draw that congregation into the fullness of the framework of the New Testament pattern for church life. And that may look different in different places and at different times, depending on where you are and the particular people that you have. So I think one of the things that we learn just by experience is that the church is not a matter of one size fits all. And so you need to learn to adapt to the congregation, in my case, of which you're a minister, appropriately adapt to it. And on the other hand, if you become a member, you need to realize that there's a necessity of seeking to release what you had in the church to which you formerly belonged in order to embrace what you're given in the church to which you now belong. Because sometimes I think I've encountered people who just cannot go to any other church than the church that they once went to. And you realize that actually something has happened to slightly misshape their Christian life. Sometimes actually it's been caused by the ministry that they've been under. And sometimes caused for ill in the sense that the ministry they've been under may not have opened them up to an ability to feed on a variety of ministries. And so, I think as you move from one congregation to another, there's always this challenge to adaptability. And always this challenge to see what is central in the church and what is peripheral, and not to confuse the two. Because when you confuse the two, you end up not being able to adapt to the new situation.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful point on what is essential, what is central, what is peripheral, and I think the sad story of many of our churches is we get those priorities backwards, or we invert them, unfortunately.
Yeah.
With our
I think another thing I would say, Pat, because I have seen this from time to time, is I think it's very important if you move from one church to another, to realize that part of the pain of that is going to be that you are no longer who you were in that previous church. And I think I've noticed increasingly, maybe over the last 25 years and more, I think probably slightly more, a very increased consciousness, or at least a speaking about that consciousness among people of what their gift is. And so our gifting, I've no idea where that new language came from, but it's become very common language. My gifting is. And it always kind of startles me inside when in an early conversation with someone who's coming into the church says, my gifting is. Because one of the things I think I've noticed and have come to fear is that when you think that way, what you are looking for is the church, as it were, to say to you, well, if that's your gifting here, this is your place. Instead of recognizing that the first thing I need to do when I go to a church is become part of that church, and wherever there seems to be a need that I am able to meet, I should do that. Because I think I've seen quite a number of people become very disenchanted with the church to which they've gone because the sea has not opened up and they have not been given a place for their particular gift. And I think they've not recognized that their particular gift isn't actually for them. It's for others. And the way other people in the church will recognize that you have got a gift is that you do whatever comes to your hand with a servant spirit. And within that context, if the Lord has a purpose to use some particular gift among his people, the way will open up. But if you move to another church with the consciousness, well, this is my gift, so this church should make room for it, you've really begun to see the church as your servant rather than you being its servant.
I think you do an excellent job of bringing that out in chapter 9 of View from the Foot, or Christian Service, where you focus on Christ's washing of the disciples' feet. And if the King of Glory will work on such humble tasks, who are we to come into churches and to require a teaching position to feel like my gifting is being appreciated? So, yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, can I ask you some questions about baptism?
Yeah.
And it might not be what most people expect. I think when you talk about focusing on the essentials, focusing on the foundational first principles of the church, I think you make the point in your chapter on baptism that sometimes we are lost in the debate of who should be baptized. And you're not saying that those are irrelevant or unhelpful, but sometimes we are so focused on that we fail to think about, reflect on, meditate on what baptism is and how we can benefit from it moving on in our Christian life and looking back to our baptism. You tell an interesting story about a particularly bright student of yours who you said gave you a lesson on baptism. I wonder if you could share that for the listeners.
Yeah. Maybe I can preface it by saying, there's a chapter on, if I remember rightly, a chapter on baptism and a chapter on the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. Because these need to be in a book on the church. These are Christ's gifts to us and they're important. At the same time, I'm a Presbyterian, but I tried to write both of those chapters in such a way that, that no matter what connection you had in a church, at the end of the day, if you were whatever kind of Baptist you were, you would be a happier and better Baptist. And however you celebrate the Lord's Supper, you would be more enriched by coming to the Lord's table or the Lord's table coming to you. So the goal there has not been narrowly to persuade people of a denominational position, but to be serviceable to whatever connection one belongs to. But to answer your question directly, this wonderful student who was from the Far East and had a Far Eastern name, but he went by Timothy. He was a very bright graduate student, very, very bright man, absolutely delightful man. And I felt I'd got to know him well enough to ask him about his real name. And I said, well, Timothy, what's your real name? And he said, it's Timothy. And Timothy is what we would call a European name. It's not a Far Eastern name. So I said, yeah, I know that, but what's your real name? And he just smiled again. He said, it's Timothy. And I said, yeah, so what's your birth name? And he told me the Far Eastern name. And I said, so that's your real name? No, he said, my real name is Timothy. That's the name I was given when I was baptized. And I thought, what a great lesson. about. I mean, it was such a wonderful illustration of what baptism is intended to mean to us, that it's a naming ceremony, and we are being named in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And from that, as, for example, I think Paul does, especially in Romans chapter 6, the significance of our baptism is telling us what our real identity is. And I think increasingly, I think it's true for most of us that baptism and the Lord's Supper ought to mean more and more to us the longer we are living the Christian life. But I think especially in the present identity crisis world in which we live, I thought, I wished somebody had made that clear to me when I was a 15-year-old, that I had this identity, that this was who I was. Because I think, if you're a 17-year-old in this world where you're supposed to make up your own identity, and governments are spending fortunes trying to help young people find their identity, and the more money they spend, the more confused the young people become. That to know who you are when you're 16, with all of this stuff going on around you, gives you a stability and a dignity that nothing else in the world does. And this is what baptism is for. That when we think about it in these terms, I think we begin to understand that therefore baptism is not so much a sign of what I have done, but it's a sign of what God has given to me in Christ, this marvelous new identity. And Timothy was such a great illustration of that. Here was somebody with this semi-unpronounceable Far Eastern name, and this new name, and the new name was the real name. I thought I can learn a lot just from this conversation I've had with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I enjoyed reading that in the book. I think you don't touch on this specifically in the book about children in worship, but I think reflecting on the identity crisis with our youth, and then the benefit of seeing baptisms, remembering our baptism, even for children who aren't partaking of the Lord's Supper in a Presbyterian context, witnessing it and seeing that this is what God's people do, being there, being present in the congregation, singing the hymns with your parents and with your peers, sitting under the Word together. That's that great, I think one of the most powerful arguments for having children with us in worship is that they would experience all of that, and this would be their identity, that from their youngest days, this is the place where they've been welcomed and where they've been, their parents have brought them.
The church should not be a babysitting agency for us, so that we can enjoy worship, as it were. And we recognize that. And we also recognize that it is actually hard work. And naturally, some children are going to be harder work than others. But I remember I must have been at a church conference somewhere, and at one of the meetings, I just sat down at a certain point, and one of the other speakers was speaking. And I was behind a family, if I remember rightly, father, mother, and 3 boys. And the 3 boys looked as though they were maximum 2 years apart. So one looked as though he was maybe 13, the next one looked as though he was maybe 10 or 11, and the next one looked as though he was 7 or 8. And watching them during the service was like watching the same child at 3 different ages. That the older one now was taking things in, not distracted. The middle one was coping pretty well, and the wee boy was a wee bit over the place. And I think Mum was at this end and Dad was at this end. But it was such a marvelous illustration to me of how it actually is. because you could see there in the second son and the first son where in God's goodness the third son was, he was heading there as well. And it's week in and week out, and there'll be some occasions that are more difficult than other occasions, and there'll be services that attract their attention more than others, sermons that are more interesting than others. But them being there among the people of God and the family of God, by that kind of spiritual osmosis, discovering who they are and what it means to be a Christian, that's not something that you can learn by going to a special class on the subject. You've actually got to be there, lead the family through that. There's no quick way to that. There's no 10 steps to that.
Yeah.
There are just 52 Sundays in the year and 52 Sundays next year. And this particular family, they'd had 1,000 Sundays, but you could see the fruit of it, and it's a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, I think in a similar sense to your Rotary Club comparison, I often think that growing up in Canada, it's very common for parents to put their kids into hockey, and hockey practices are very early in the morning, at like 5 a.m. The parents will get out of bed, they'll get in the car, they'll drive their kids to hockey, and they'll sit there and they'll watch their practice for about an hour before the kids go to school, before the parents go to work. You think what parents are willing to do to help their kids and what they value. Yeah. And if you think of that in comparison to the hard, like you say, the hard work of training your children to worship, it is hard work. But if parents are willing to do that for hockey, certainly I'll be willing to do this for worship and for that sense of identity that comes with it. You in one of the chapters, you make an interesting distinction, in the chapter called "Have You Ever Arrived at Church?" And you make this distinction. You mentioned that there was a proponent of or a church growth analyst who you were speaking to, and he was measuring success of a church by external things like the eloquence of the preaching or the quality of the music. And you wrote in response to that, if there is a way of assessing the quality of our worship, it is the degree to which we bring it with reverence and awe. You reference Hebrews 12 there. Otherwise, it may be that the object of our worship is no longer the Lord, but our own worship of him. For true worshipers are not conscious of worship so much as they are of God and his presence. If this is the case, then there is a difference between going to church and arriving at church. And I wondered if you could unpack that distinction for us.
Yeah. I think something I've noticed, Pat, is what I sometimes think of as vicarious worship, in which say I have a pastor who is really fine Orthodox preacher, that, well, what I believe is what he believes. And, I've often enough heard people say, and, maybe I'm old and grungy, but I just had a wee bit of a suspicion when they've told me that they sit under so-and-so's ministry, that they're actually trying to tell me something about themselves, about their spirit. If they sit under his ministry, then, they are clearly persons of spiritual maturity. And it's this kind of transfer of the activity of worship to what is, purely horizontal, the quality of the preaching, the the organ or the band, or the soloist or the choir, or, you know, and I think, well, what we are looking at is what we are doing. And so long as our eyes are on what we are doing, we have actually missed the point of what we are doing. That our eyes are on the Lord. I remember my great minister when I was a student, William Still, spoke at a very famous convention once, and he was a complete unknown at it, and he really was a bit of a fish out of water. And he was walking away from one of the meetings one night, and a lady just turned to him and obviously didn't recognize he was actually one of the speakers. And she said to him, "Wasn't he absolutely wonderful tonight?" And Mr. Still said to her, "Who?" And, you know, he was making the point, you know, where were your eyes? Were your eyes still on the preacher? And I think it actually is true in when the Spirit comes and really works through preaching, we become largely oblivious to the preacher. He fades into the background. And the same with the music. It supports the words, and it's the upwardness of the words that become important to us. And for that reason, worship is a much more exalted reality than I think we often think of it. And it's harder soul work than often we are prepared to put into it. But, you know, here I am singing along and happen to be singing something I enjoy singing. And what I'm doing is enjoying singing what I enjoy singing. And the words have become, you know, they're coming off my tongue, but the weight of the words is not affecting my heart. And so I think this, to me anyway, this is a great challenge to take what I'm doing much more seriously and to seek to have my gaze focused in the right place. And I think maybe in the book I use the illustration of Isaiah. You know, if that experience took place in the temple in Isaiah 6, which I imagine it does, that he'd been there plenty of times. But on this occasion, he saw and experienced something that was of a different order altogether. And, you know, I think maybe in the book I use that as an illustration of him thinking, have I just gone to church for the first time in my life? And when that, you know, I think when you experience the presence of God in that way, you can never really be satisfied with anything less. Granted, there are going to be special occasions, special experiences we may have. And often they seem to me to be completely unrelated to the size of the congregation. Can be in a massive congregation, can be in a tiny congregation, but you are conscious that you have met with God, and that's the supreme goal in our worship. That's the goal of our praise, it's the goal of our praying, and it's certainly the goal of our preaching. Remember, I think maybe he says this in his book, Preaching and Preachers. Martin Lloyd-Jones says he can forgive a preacher almost anything as long as the preaching of the word brings him into a sense of the presence of God. And it's that, I think, that cleanses and transforms us in our whole being and nurtures us, that we have met with him. And we have some sense of what Paul is speaking about in to the Corinthians when he says the outsider comes in and says, surely God is here, he's among you in this place. So
It's sort of a frightening thought that you can go to church and not really be there. I think sometimes when again, I often reflect on my own context of father, my wife and I, we're small children, and we get them all in the car, and you get there, and they're dressed nicely, and everything looks nice, and we sit down, we get to our pew, but then you can be there, and an hour and a half can go by, and you weren't really there, because you weren't focusing on the Lord, and you were being distracted by these secondary things. And I think it's certainly an exhortation to us that we would depend on the Spirit on the Lord's day, and not to go in to sit in our pews and to just relax and kind of tuck in to a service.
Yes.
Yeah. That's
okay.
helpful. Yeah. Yeah, well, I have one final question for you, and I appreciate all the time you've given me this afternoon to talk about your newest book. Because I've been reflecting on the release of this book on God's church, of being devoted to God's church at a time when, for many of us, some people here in the United States are back at church, some people aren't back at church yet. I don't know exactly what it's like in the UK right now, but at least in the West, we've never really had an experience of not being able to go to church.
No.
So it seems like being a part of a local church it's never been a bigger issue than it is today. I don't remember ever having so many ecclesiological conversations with people in our church about the church and state relationship, and a theology of presence, and how important is it to be together. What about the one another passages, and how we're commanded to love one another, and to sharpen one another, to exhort one another, to rebuke one another. How do we do that when we can't be together? So my first thought was that this is a really pressing issue now, whereas maybe it wasn't before. But then the more I thought about it, in different parts of the world, in China or in the Middle East, for example, with the persecution that's going on, the threat of not being able to gather is a regular occurrence.
Yes.
And certainly it was in the early church as well. And then I also thought even broader about, what about our brothers and sisters in nursing homes, and they're not able to make it to church like they used to, and they're getting on in their age, and it's just becoming more and more of a battle to make it to church. And so I'm saying all this to build up to my question, which is, what does it look like to be devoted to God's church in a time when it's hard to be together as a church?
Yeah, something happened in the connection there, Pat. Maybe you could repeat the question.
Yeah, sure. So I'm saying all this to build up to my question, which is, what does it mean to be devoted to God's church in a time, for many of us, when it's hard to get together as a church?
Yeah. It's one of the interesting things about the use of the word church in the New Testament. It's the word ecclesia, that it's also used was used in the secular world of an assembly. But when the people dispersed, there no longer was an ecclesia. So you were only the ecclesia, the assembly, when you actually assembled. And by contrast with that, the way the word is used of Christ Church in the New Testament makes it clear that you're that ecclesia whether you're assembled or not assembled. You're that ecclesia because you've been called out of the world to union with Jesus Christ, and in being united to Jesus Christ, you're united to those who belong to Jesus Christ. And I think it's this reality that hopefully we have actually experienced in the last 6 months or so, that the ache that is in us is because while we are still the church, severed, as it were, from one another. We are most truly that church when we are gathered together for the worship of God. And at least my own hope is that the expressions I've heard from people of how much they miss the gatherings here in Scotland at the moment, just at the moment, over the last couple of months now, we've been able to meet a maximum of 50 wearing face masks and not singing. And in our church, that means that you are able to assemble only once every few weeks. And you get this very palpable sense of people just longing to be together and longing to be able to express praise to God. And, you know, I hope that that's going to be a lasting sense. And that while I am very grateful for the technological facilities that give you a semblance of the life of the church, I hope that people are not foolish enough to think that you can be the church just as well that way. One of my sons works for one of the major companies that everybody knows the name, and he has teams of these technological experts doing, I have no idea what they do, in different parts of the world. And of course, they have all the sophisticated technology that they're able to communicate very easily with each other. But I've noticed he's worked with two very big multinationals. I've noticed in both cases that he flies around the world to see people face to face. When from one point of view, there's absolutely no need to do that, except that I think people have this very fundamental sense that you don't really know anybody until you're breathing the same atmosphere, until you can smell their breath, be with them in a three-dimensional way. So it would be, I think, the height of blindness and folly and theological stupidity if anybody were to think, as I fear some people may think, well, we've done it this way, we can continue to do it that way. What we would end up, if we did that, we would end up as grossly distorted Christians. We are made from the very beginning, in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, we've been made to be together in these communities. And, you know, I hope it will be true of God's people that we will, just as we long to be together more, we will appreciate more the amazing privilege, I mean, the tremendously stabilizing, nurturing phenomenon that we belong to the people of God when we are surrounded by people who don't belong anywhere and they don't really know who they are. It just underlines for me, again, what an amazing gift the church is to us from the Lord Jesus.
Well, amen. I think that's a good place for us to bring our discussion to a close. I appreciate your wisdom and your stories, and again, I've enjoyed getting to read the book and to meditate more on church and what a gift it is from Christ to us. So thanks again. If you want to find the book, you can find it at bandofTruth.org, other Christian bookstores online, and it's called Devoted to God's Church, Core Values of Christian Fellowship. Sinclair, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate talking to you.